Imagine you're sitting on your back porch, miles away from the nearest neighbor, staring into the dark tree line of the North Carolina wilderness. The sun has been down for hours, and the only sound is the wind through the pines. But then, out of the blackness, you hear it a soft, humming melody. It's the exact lullaby your mother used to sing to you every night to help you sleep. Your heart skips a beat, but not because of nostalgia. It skips because your mother passed away 15 years ago, and that voice is coming from the top of a 60-foot oak tree where no human could possibly be standing. You realize with a jolt of pure adrenaline that whatever is singing to you isn't a memory, it's a predator that's been waiting 15 years for you to finally listen. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So, if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite childhood teddy bear and replace its stuffing with angry, live hornets right before they go to bed. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to the jagged, fog-shrouded peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains. This is a place where the forest is so old it feels like the trees are leaning in to hear you breathe, and the mist rolls through the valleys like a living thing. Our main character is a man named Elias. Elias was a carpenter, a man who worked with his hands and prided himself on his no-nonsense attitude. He didn't believe in ghosts, he didn't believe in cryptids, and he certainly didn't believe the local legends about the pale crawlers that supposedly stalked the Appalachian Hollows. After his mother died, he inherited her secluded cabin, the same place where he grew up, and he moved back in to fix it up and sell it. But in the spring of 2023, Elias realized that some inheritances come with things you can't see on a deed. The first week was normal, a lot of sanding floors and fixing leaky pipes, but by the second week, the atmosphere at the cabin shifted. It started with what we call an oppressive silence. Every bird, every cricket, and every rustle of the wind through the hemlock simply ceased to exist. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that made Elias's ears ring with a deafening pressure. He began to feel a prickle on the back of his neck, the primal instinct that tells you you're being watched by something that doesn't have a name. One night, around 2 a.m., Elias was woken up by a sound that made his blood turn to ice. It was a hum, a soft, rhythmic lullaby coming from the woods just past his bedroom window. He recognized it instantly. It was a specific song his mother had made up just for him, a song no one else in the world knew. He sat bolt upright, his breath misting in the cold room. He grabbed his high-intensity flashlight and shined the beam out into the trees. The light sliced through the fog, and for a split second, he saw it. Perched on a thick branch high above the ground was a figure. It was taller than any person had a right to be, easily 9 feet tall, and so pale it looked like a streak of bone against the dark bark. Its skin was translucent, stretched so tight over its skeletal ribs that it looked like wet parchment. It had no lips, just a frozen, jagged grin, and eyes that were nothing but hollow, black pits of endless, starving hunger. The creature didn't run. It stayed perfectly still, staring back at him. And then it began to sing again. But it didn't use its own throat. It used his mother's voice. The pitch, the warmth, the slight southern drawl, it was a perfect, high-fidelity replica. Elias, honey, the voice whispered through the glass. It's so cold out here. Won't you let me in? Mommy's home. Elias felt a wave of pure, unadulterated terror. He realized then that this thing, this Wendigo, wasn't just a hunter. It was a mimic that had been harvesting his memories from the very air. It wasn't just after his life. It wanted to steal his peace. He spent the rest of the night barricaded in the hallway, clutching his grandfather's old shotgun, listening to the creature circle the cabin. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs snapping and clicking like breaking dry wood with every step. Every few minutes, it would scratch at the siding with fingers that sounded like they were 3 feet long. When the sun finally rose, Elias didn't pack his tools, he didn't lock the doors, he ran for his truck and pinned the throttle, driving until he was 3 states away. He never went back. He sold the cabin at a massive loss to a developer who wanted the land. But the story doesn't end there. The demolition crew went in a month later to tear the cabin down. They found the house completely empty, except for one thing. In the master bedroom, where Elias's mother had spent her final days, the crew found a perfect, intricate spiral made of thousands of human teeth, all of them polished to a shine. In the center of that spiral was Elias's old childhood music box, which had been missing for 20 years. When the foreman opened the music box, it didn't play the song it was supposed to. Instead, a voice came out of the tiny speakers, a voice that sounded exactly like Elias, sobbing and begging for his mother to come back. There is a theory on Reddit that the Wendigo doesn't just eat your flesh. It harvests the tethers of your soul, the sounds and memories that bind you to the world. It uses them to build a nest for the next victim. But the real, bone-chilling question is this. Elias is living in a high-rise apartment in Chicago now, miles away from any forest. But last night, he woke up to a sound coming from his baby monitor in the next room. He looked at the screen and saw a long, pale hand with skeletal fingers reaching into the crib, and then he heard his own voice coming through the monitor, singing that same lullaby to his newborn son. What just happened? Imagine you were sitting in your deer stand, perched 15 feet above the forest floor, waiting for a prize buck to cross the clearing during the final hour of golden light. You scan the tree line with your binoculars, but instead of a deer, your lenses focus on a gap between two ancient oaks where you see a face. Not a human face, and not a mask, but a raw, wet skull wrapped in layers of glistening, muscle-red tissue that looks like it was freshly peeled. You realize with a jolt of pure adrenaline that the face doesn't have any skin, and as you watch, it opens a lipless mouth to mimic the exact sound of your own safety catch, clicking off even though your hands are shaking so hard you haven't even touched your rifle. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite pair of high-end hunting binoculars and smear them with thick, opaque red paint right before they head out for a trophy hunt in the deep wilderness. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to the dense, unforgiving wilderness of the North Maine woods, a massive stretch of commercial timberland where the logging roads are private, the cell service is non-existent, and the trees are so old they seem to remember things humanity has long forgotten. Our main character is a man named Garrett. Garrett was a veteran woodsman, the kind of guy who felt more at home in a canvas tent than a suburban living room. He was a meticulous hunter who respected the land, followed the seasons, and never spooked easily. But in November of 2019, Garrett saw something in those woods that made him realize he was no longer at the top of the food chain. Garrett had traveled nearly 40 miles past the last paved road to reach a remote valley he called the Deadwood Notch. He had a small, primitive cabin there, and he planned to spend the week tracking a legendary 12-point buck. The first few days were standard, cold, quiet, and filled with the scent of pine and wood smoke. But on the fourth afternoon, the atmosphere in the notch shifted. The wind, which had been howling through the canyons, suddenly died down to an oppressive silence. Every bird, every squirrel, and every rustling leaf simply ceased to exist. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind that makes you feel like the forest is holding its breath, waiting for a predator to strike. Garrett was sitting in his makeshift blind, a camouflage screen nestled between two boulders, when he felt a prickle on the back of his neck. He slowly turned his head, expecting to see a black bear or a coyote. Instead, he saw the face. It was peering out from behind a thicket of hemlocks about 50 yards away. Through his high-powered scope, Garrett saw a head that was impossibly elongated, with a jaw that seemed to hang too low. But the most horrifying part was the texture. There was no fur, no hair, and no skin. It looked like a biological diagram come to life, raw, red tendons and pulsing muscles exposed to the freezing air. It had no eyelids, just two milky, pale pits of endless, starving hunger that seemed to stare right through Garrett's soul. Garrett's heart didn't just beat, it slammed against his ribs. He watched as the creature moved, and it didn't walk. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, snapping and clicking like breaking bone with every step. It was easily 9 feet tall, its skeletal ribs pushing through the raw tissue of its chest. Garrett realized with a wave of cold nausea that this thing was a mimic. It wasn't just watching him, it was learning him. It began to make a sound, a low, rhythmic clicking that perfectly matched the beat of Garrett's own panicked heart. He didn't fire. Every instinct he had as a hunter told him that a bullet wouldn't stop this thing. It would only invite it closer. Garrett backed away, his boots crunching on the frozen leaves, never breaking eye contact with the lipless, grinning face in the trees. As he reached the edge of the clearing, the creature opened its mouth and, in Garrett's own voice, whispered, "I see you, Garrett. I can see your heart." Garrett turned and ran. He didn't pack his gear, he didn't grab his trophies, he just ran for his truck. He felt the creature right behind him, jumping through the branches with an agility that was physically impossible. Every time he stumbled, he heard a wet, guttural laugh that sounded like a serrated blade tearing through thick leather. He burst into the cabin, barricaded the door, and spent the night clutching his shotgun, listening to the sound of long, sharp fingernails dragging across the log walls, and his voice singing his favorite childhood song outside the window. When the sun finally rose, Garrett didn't wait. He pinned the throttle of his truck and drove until he hit the first town with a sheriff's office. Search and rescue teams later went back to the Deadwood Notch to retrieve his belongings. They found the cabin completely intact, but the interior was covered in a thick, translucent slime that smelled like copper and old earth. They found Garrett's rifle, but the barrel had been twisted into a perfect, intricate spiral, as if the metal had been soft as clay. There is a theory on Reddit that the Wendigo, the thing with the skinless face, doesn't just hunt for meat, it harvests the identity of its prey. It peels away the layers of who you are until there's nothing left but the raw, starving hunger it represents. But the real bone-chilling question is this. Garrett moved to the city and never stepped foot in a forest again. But last night, he woke up to a scratching sound on his bedroom door. He looked under the gap, and he saw a pair of long, pale fingers with no skin on them sliding a small piece of paper into the room. It was a photo of Garrett taken yesterday at the grocery store, and on the back, in Garrett's own handwriting, it said, "Your skin fits me better than yours." What just happened? Imagine you are waking up in your tent at 2 o'clock in the morning to the sound of something heavy dragging itself across the dry pine needles just inches from your head. You hold your breath, staring at the thin nylon wall of your tent, and you see a shadow cast by the dying embers of your campfire, a shadow of a hand with fingers that are nearly 2 feet long. You realize with a jolt of pure adrenaline that whatever is standing outside your tent is nearly 10 feet tall, and as you reach for your flashlight, the thing leans down and whispers your own name in a voice that sounds like a recording being played at half speed. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite portable camping stove and replace the fuel canister with a pressurized can of neon pink spray paint right before they head out for a weekend in the deep woods. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to the high country of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, a place where the granite peaks are as sharp as razors and the forests are so old they seem to hold their breath as you pass through them. Our main character is a man named Derek. Derek was an ultralight backpacker, a guy who lived for the sufferfest of 20-mile days and sleeping under the stars. He was a veteran of the Pacific Crest Trail and felt more at home in the wilderness than in his own apartment. He was a man of cold logic, a man who believed every sound in the woods had a biological explanation until one night in the summer of 2020 when the forest decided to break him. Derek had hiked deep into a dead zone near the Ansel Adams Wilderness, a place where the GPS signals tend to drop and the silence feels heavier than usual. He found a perfect, secluded spot near a high alpine lake and set up his minimal camp. As the sun dipped below the peaks, painting the sky in a bruised purple, Derek noticed something strange. The forest didn't just get quiet. It fell into what we call an oppressive silence. No crickets, No rustling leaves, no owls. It was a suffocating quiet that made his ears ring with a deafening pressure. He was sitting by his small stove when he looked across the clearing toward the tree line. There, standing just at the edge of the light, was a figure. It was impossibly tall, easily 9 or 10 feet, and so pale it looked like a streak of bone against the dark pines. Derek froze. His mind tried to categorize it. A tree stump? A trick of the light? But then, the figure shifted. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs snapping and clicking like breaking dry wood with every movement. Derek's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached for his headlamp and clicked it to the highest setting. The beam sliced through the dark, hitting the figure directly. Derek felt a wave of cold nausea wash over him. It was a creature that looked like a man who had been stretched on a rack until his skin turned translucent. Its ribs were pushing through its chest, and its face was a nightmare of tight gray skin pulled over a skeletal jaw. It had no lips, just a frozen, jagged grin, and eyes that were nothing but hollow, black pits of endless, starving hunger. The creature didn't run. It just stood there, swaying slightly, like a branch in the wind. And then, it spoke. But it didn't use its own voice. It used Derek's voice. It whispered, "I think I saw something over there," using the exact words Derek had muttered to himself only 10 minutes earlier. Derek realized with a jolt of terror that this thing, this Wendigo, had been recording him from the shadows, harvesting his voice to use as bait. Derek retreated into his tent, zipping the door with trembling hands. He sat there in the dark, clutching his bear spray, listening as the creature began to circle the campsite. It was a rhythmic, dragging sound times step, click, drag. Step, click, drag, asterisk. Every few minutes, the thing would lean in close to the tent fabric, and Derek could hear its ragged, wet breathing, a sound like slush being stirred in a bucket. Then, the creature would whisper in his sister's voice, then his mother's, and finally, it began to scream in a high-pitched, metallic distortion that sounded like a choir of people dying at once. Derek didn't wait for the sun. He burst out of his tent and ran. He didn't grab his pack. He didn't grab his boots. He ran in his camp shoes, feeling the creature jumping through the canopy above him, moving with an agility that defied every law of physics. Every time Derek stumbled, he heard a wet, guttural laugh that sounded like a serrated blade tearing through leather. He finally reached the trailhead at dawn, his feet bleeding and his mind shattered. And he drove until he was 100 miles away. Search and rescue later went back to his campsite after Derek reported a bear encounter. They found his tent completely intact, but the interior was covered in a thick, translucent slime that smelled like copper and old earth. What they found outside, however, was worse. They found a circle of Derek's own gear, his stove, his water filter, his map, arranged in a perfect, intricate spiral around the tent. In the center of the spiral was Derek's cell phone. When the authorities checked the phone, they found a video recorded at 3:15 a.m. It was a 3-minute clip of Derek sleeping inside the tent, filmed from a perspective times inside, times the tent, held by a long, pale hand with skeletal fingers. The audio on the video wasn't Derek snoring. It was a voice that sounded exactly like the lead ranger whispering, "He looks so much like me. I think I'll keep him." There is a theory on Reddit that the Wendigo, the thing that stands at the edge of the camp, doesn't just want to kill you, it wants to replace you. It marks its prey and studies them until it can walk out of the woods in their skin. But the real bone-chilling question is this. Derek moved to a different state and hasn't stepped foot in the mountains in years. But last night, he got a text from his own number. It was a photo of him sitting in his living room, taken from the dark window behind him, with a caption that said, "The spiral is finished. Are you ready to come home?" What just happened? Imagine waking up in your tent at 3 a.m. to the sound of your own voice whispering outside the zipper, begging yourself to let him in because it's getting too cold. You reach for your flashlight, but before you can click it on, a long, skeletal finger gray as a tombstone slides through a tiny gap in the mesh, And you realize with a jolt of pure adrenaline that the you outside isn't a dream and it definitely isn't human. You're stuck in the middle of the Black Hills, 50 miles from the nearest paved road, and you've just realized that something has been studying your voice all day, waiting for the perfect moment to take your place. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite heavy-duty camping tent and carefully slice a 3-foot hole right through the floorboards just before they head out for a solo trip into the deep wilderness. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to the rugged, ancient landscape of South Dakota, specifically the Black Hills. This is a place of jagged granite peaks and ponderosa pines so thick they seem to swallow the light even at noon. Our main character is a man named Ryan. Ryan was a veteran hiker, the kind of guy who found more peace in the whisper of wind through the needles than in the noise of any city. He wasn't a novice, he knew how to read the weather and track a mountain lion, and he certainly didn't believe in the old legends about spirits that haunt the high ridges. But in October of 2022, the Black Hills decided to teach Ryan that some legends aren't just stories, they are warnings written in the silence of the woods. Ryan had hiked 12 miles into the backcountry, moving deeper into a sector that the locals avoided because the compasses tended to spin erratically there. He planned to spend 3 nights completely off the grid. The first day was idyllic, crisp air, and golden light. But as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, the entire atmosphere shifted. The forest fell into what we call an oppressive silence. Every bird, every cricket, every rustle of wind simply ceased to exist. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind that makes you feel like the trees are leaning in, holding their breath just to hear you breathe. That night, Ryan was sitting by his small campfire when he heard a whistle. It was a faint, melodic tune, the exact lullaby his mother used to sing to him when he was a boy. The only problem? His mother had passed away 10 years ago. He grabbed his flashlight and shined the beam toward the tree line. There, standing behind a massive old-growth pine, he saw it. It was taller than any person had a right to be, easily 9 feet tall and impossibly thin, like a line of ink drawn against the darkness. Its gray skin was stretched so tight over its skeletal frame that it looked like wet parchment, and its eyes were nothing but hollow pits of endless, starving hunger. The creature didn't walk. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs snapping and clicking like breaking bone with every step. Ryan didn't wait. He scrambled into his tent, zipping it shut with trembling hands, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He sat there in the dark, clutching his hunting knife, listening as the creature began to circle the tent. It started to mimic Ryan's own heavy, shuddering breaths, echoing them back to him from the dark. And then it used Ryan's own voice to whisper, "I can see you in there, Ryan. I'm almost ready." Ryan realized then that this thing wasn't just a predator. It was a collector of identities. It was waiting for him to break. When Ryan stumbled over his gear inside the tent, the creature let out a wet, guttural laugh that sounded like a serrated blade tearing through thick leather. He didn't wait for dawn. He burst out of the tent and ran. He didn't grab his gear. He didn't grab his boots. He ran until his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass and fire, feeling the creature jumping through the branches above him with an agility that was physically impossible. He finally reached his truck, pinning the throttle and driving like a madman until he reached a crowded diner 3 towns away. But the story doesn't end there. Search and rescue teams later went back to find his camp. They found the tent completely shredded, but the interior was covered in a thick, translucent slime that smelled like copper and old earth. They found Ryan's handheld camera, but when they played the footage, there was no video of Ryan. There was only 30 minutes of a wet, clicking sound coming from inside a dark space, followed by a voice that sounded exactly like the lead investigator, speaking in a low, intimate whisper. "I found him. He's right here." There's a theory on Reddit that the Wendigo doesn't just eat your flesh. It harvests the very essence of who you are. It wears your life like a mask until the mask rots away. But the real bone-chilling question is this. Ryan moved 3 states away and hasn't stepped foot in a forest since. But last night, his neighbor called the police, claiming she heard Ryan's voice coming from his backyard, begging her to open the window because he had lost his keys, even though Ryan was sitting right there in his living room watching the news. What just happened? Imagine you are hiking through the dense, ancient woods of the Appalachian Trail just as the sun begins to drop behind the jagged peaks, and suddenly you hear a woman screaming for help from a deep ravine just 50 yards off the path. You drop your pack and prepare to rush toward the sound. But then you freeze because the scream is repeated word for word with the exact same inflection and a robotic, rhythmic tone that sounds like a skipping record player. You realize with a jolt of pure terror that the woman in the ravine isn't a person at all, but something that has been practicing those screams for 100 years, just waiting for someone like you to follow the sound into the dark. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week, so if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite pair of waterproof hiking boots and fill them with fast-drying industrial cement right before they head out on a 20-mile trek into the deep wilderness. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia, an area known for its breathtaking beauty and a history of strange disappearances that the Forest Service simply refuses to talk about. Our main character is a man named Caleb. Caleb was an experienced hiker, a man who found more peace in the whisper of wind through pine needles than in the noise of any city. He knew the unwritten rules of the mountains, rules like never looking up into the trees if you hear your name called, and never, under any circumstances, answering a cry for help that sounds just a little too perfect. But in the autumn of 2021, Caleb encountered something that made him realize that even the rules can't protect you once you've been marked. Caleb had hiked nearly 12 miles into the backcountry, moving deeper into a sector that the locals call the Starving Valley. He planned to spend 2 nights off the grid, seeking the kind of silence that only the deep woods can provide. The first day was idyllic, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest fell into what we call an oppressive silence. Every bird, every cricket, every rustle of wind simply ceased to exist. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind that makes you feel like the trees are leaning in, holding their breath, just to hear you breathe. That night, Caleb was woken up at exactly 3 a.m. by a cry for help. It was a woman's voice, coming from the thick brush just outside his tent. "Help me. I'm lost." "Please, it's so dark." Caleb sat perfectly still, his hand gripping his hunting knife, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He expected to hear the struggle of someone moving through the undergrowth, but the voice was stationary. It didn't move. And then it repeated the exact same phrase, with the exact same sob at the end, over and over again. Caleb knew this was a mimic. He stayed awake until the first light of dawn, staring at the thin nylon walls, terrified that if he moved, the thing outside would know he was awake. When the sun finally rose, he packed his gear with frantic, shaking hands and practically sprinted back toward the trailhead. But the forest began to warp around him. The landmarks he had passed only hours before a fallen log, a specific rock formation, were gone, replaced by thickets of thorns that seemed to grow across the path as he watched. Every time he paused to catch his breath, he saw it in his peripheral vision. A pale, spindly shape moving with a jerky, unnatural gait far too fast for any living creature. It was easily 9 feet tall, its gray skin stretched so tight over its skeletal frame that it looked like wet parchment, and its eyes, they weren't eyes at all, but hollow, black pits of endless, tea-starving hunger. The horror wasn't just in the creature's appearance. It was in the way it used sound. It began to mimic Caleb's own heavy, shuddering breaths, echoing them back to him from the trees. When Caleb stumbled over a root, the creature let out a wet, guttural laugh that sounded like a serrated blade tearing through thick leather. It began to call his name not in its own voice, but in the voice of his younger brother. Caleb didn't stop. He pushed himself past the point of exhaustion, his lungs feeling like they were filled with broken glass and fire. He finally burst through the trees and scrambled into his car, fumbling with the keys as the pale figure stood at the edge of the woods, watching him with a frozen, lipless grin. But the story doesn't end there. Search and rescue teams later went back to that sector after reports of strange noises. They found Caleb's campsite, but his tent was gone. In its place was a large, flat-topped granite boulder covered in a perfect, intricate spiral of animal bones, all bleached white and polished. In the center of the boulder, they found a single handheld camera. Caleb's camera, the one he swore was in his bag when he reached his car. When the authorities played the footage, there was no video of Caleb. There was only 30 minutes of a wet clicking sound, followed by a voice that sounded exactly like the lead investigator. Speaking in a low, intimate whisper, "I found them. They're right here." There is a theory on Reddit that the Wendigo doesn't just hunt for meat. It harvests your identity. Once you answer the cry for help, you've been marked. But the real bone-chilling question is this. Caleb moved away and never went back to the mountains. But last night, his wife called the police, claiming she woke up to find Caleb standing in the backyard in the middle of a thunderstorm, staring at the house and whispering her name in a voice that sounded like static. What just happened? Imagine you are standing in the middle of a forest so dense that the canopy above chokes out the sun, leaving the world below in a permanent, sickly twilight. You've been hiking for hours, following a trail that was clearly marked on your map, but suddenly, the path simply vanishes beneath a carpet of dead, black leaves that seem to swallow the sound of your footsteps. The birds have stopped singing. The wind has died down to a deathly, unnatural calm. And in the center of a perfectly circular clearing, where the trees look twisted as if they grew in constant agony, you find it. A massive, intricate spiral made of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of small animal bones, ribs, vertebrae, and skulls, all bleached to a haunting porcelain white and polished as if by human hands. You tell yourself it's just a strange art project, a prank by some local teenager with too much time on his hands, but then you notice a single black crow's feather standing perfectly upright in the exact center of the spiral, and you see a drop of dark red marrow still leaking from a fresh break in a deer's femur. That's when you hear it. Your own voice whispering from the shadows directly behind your ear saying, "Don't go yet, I'm not finished with you." If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite pair of waterproof hiking boots and fill them with fast-drying industrial cement right before they head out on a 20-mile trek into the deepest, most forbidden part of the wilderness. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to the sprawling, ancient forests of Massachusetts, an area known for a complicated history of strange disappearances, ancient stone structures, and unsettling events that defy every known law of logic and science. Our main character is a man named Leo. Now, Leo wasn't a novice. He was a seasoned hiker, a man who found more peace in the whisper of wind through pine needles than in the noise of any city street. He was the kind of person who kept a meticulous log of his travels, knew how to read the clouds like a book, and could track a deer across dry rock. He certainly didn't believe in the campfire tales about monsters lurking in what the locals call the Forbidden Triangle. To Leo, the woods were a sanctuary, not a graveyard. But on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, the forest decided to show Leo that some legends aren't just stories, they are warnings written in blood. Leo had hiked nearly 15 miles into the backcountry, moving deeper into a sector that most hikers avoid because the compasses tend to spin erratically there. He planned to spend 2 nights completely off the grid, seeking the kind of silence that only the deep woods can provide. The first day was idyllic. The air was crisp, the leaves were a riot of orange and gold, and he felt a profound sense of solitude. He set up his camp near a small, nameless creek and watched the stars emerge. But as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, the entire atmosphere shifted. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted, and the forest fell into what we call an oppressive silence. Every cricket, every rustle of wind, every natural sound simply ceased to exist. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind that makes you feel like the trees are leaning in, holding their breath just to hear your heartbeat. That night, Leo was woken up at exactly 3:33 a.m. by a single, sharp twig snap right outside his tent. It was a sound so deliberate, it felt like a knock on a door. He sat perfectly still, his hand gripping his hunting knife, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He expected to hear the heavy breathing of a bear or the scuffle of a coyote, but all he heard in return was a low, rhythmic humming. It wasn't a human voice, and it wasn't a machine. It was a guttural, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the very ground, through his sleeping pad, and directly into the bones of his legs. It felt less like a sound and more like a physical weight pressing down on the tent. He stayed awake until the first gray light of dawn, staring at the thin nylon walls, terrified that if he blinked, whatever was outside would find its way in. The next morning, Leo tried to shake off his fear. He told himself it was just infrasound, or a vivid dream brought on by the thin mountain air. But as he packed his gear and continued toward his next waypoint, he realized the forest was no longer familiar. The trees looked different, grayer, taller, with branches that looked like reaching fingers. And then he found the grove. It was a stand of pines that looked as if they had been scorched, though there was no sign of fire. In the center sat a large, flat-topped granite boulder, and on top of it was that perfect, intricate spiral of animal bones. As Leo stepped closer, he realized the bones were arranged by size and type, creating a hypnotic pattern that seemed to pulse in his vision. A wave of cold nausea washed over him as he saw a small pendant, a silver locket, resting near the edge of the spiral. He recognized it. It belonged to a hiker who had gone missing in these woods 3 years ago. He realized then that the humming he heard at night wasn't a sound of nature, it was the sound of something building this altar. He felt watched by unseen eyes from the dark, lightless spaces between the trees. Every instinct he had as a survivalist told him one thing: run. He didn't pack his gear with his usual care. He shoved everything into his bag with frantic, shaking hands and practically sprinted back the way he came. But the forest began to warp around him. The landmarks he had passed only hours before a fallen log, a specific rock formation, were gone, replaced by thickets of thorns that seemed to grow across the path as he watched. Every time he paused to catch his breath, he saw it in his peripheral vision, a pale, spindly shape moving with a jerky, unnatural gait far too fast for any living creature. It was easily 9 feet tall, its gray skin stretched so tight over its skeletal frame that it looked like wet parchment, and its eyes, they weren't eyes at all, but hollow, black pits of endless, starving hunger. The horror wasn't just in the creature's appearance. It was in the way it used sound as a weapon. The thing began to mimic Leo's own heavy, shuddering breaths, echoing them back to him from the trees. When Leo stumbled over a root, the creature let out a wet, guttural laugh that sounded like a serrated blade tearing through thick leather. It began to call his name, not in its own voice, but in the voice of his younger brother, then in the voice of a crying child. And finally, it used Leo's own voice to scream for help, using the exact same words Leo had whispered to himself just minutes before. Leo didn't stop. He pushed himself past the point of exhaustion, his lungs feeling like they were filled with broken glass and fire. He finally burst through the final stretch of trees, stumbling onto the gravel of the parking lot. Dia scrambled into his car, fumbling with the keys, his eyes darting to the tree line where he saw the pale figure standing perfectly still, watching him. He locked the doors and drove like a madman, not stopping until he reached a crowded diner 3 towns away, where the bright fluorescent lights and the smell of grease finally made the world feel real again. But the story doesn't end there. Search and rescue teams, acting on Leo's frantic report, went back to that grove 2 days later. They found the granite boulder, but the bone spiral had vanished as if it had never existed. There were no tracks, no blood, and no sign of a struggle. In the center of the boulder, however, they found a single handheld camera, Leo's camera, the one he swore was buried deep in his backpack when he reached his car. When the authorities played the footage, there was no video of Leo's hike. There was only 30 minutes of a wet, clicking sound coming from inside a dark underground space, followed by a voice that sounded exactly like the lead investigator, speaking in a low, intimate whisper. "I can taste your fear, Leo. The spiral is almost complete, and I'm coming home." There is a theory among the deep dive communities on Reddit that the Wendigo doesn't just hunt for meat. It marks its prey. Once you lay eyes on the bone spiral, you've been invited to a ritual where you are the only guest and the only item on the menu. But the real bone-chilling question is this. If Leo truly made it out of those woods that morning, why did his brother call the police last night, crying, claiming he heard Leo's voice whispering through the air vents of their house, saying that the marrow in his bones was finally ripe for the harvest? What just happened? Imagine you find a high-end digital recorder sitting on a moss-covered stump in a valley so remote it's not even named on most maps. You press play, expecting to hear the audio log of a seasoned survivalist, but instead, you hear a man sobbing as he describes a creature standing outside his tent, a creature that is currently repeating his own whispered prayers back to him in a voice that sounds like wet gravel grinding together. You realize with a jolt of pure adrenaline that the recording was made only 10 minutes ago, and as the audio ends, you hear that same gravelly voice whispering your own name from the tree line directly behind you. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite emergency flare gun and replace the flares with colorful birthday candles right before they head out on a solo survival expedition in the deep wilderness. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to a jagged, fog-drenched landscape in the Canadian Rockies, an area where the peaks are razor-sharp and the valleys are filled with timber so old it seems to lean in to hear you breathe. Our main character is a man named Silas. Silas wasn't your average weekend camper. He was a top-tier survivalist, a man who taught courses on how to stay alive with nothing but a knife and a flint. He was a man of cold logic and iron nerves who spent months at a time living off the grid. But in October of 2022, Silas entered a valley known by local trackers as the Mouth of Echoes, and he encountered something that no amount of survival training could prepare him for. Silas had traveled deep into the backcountry to document his minimalist winter prep for his followers. He carried a digital recorder to capture his thoughts, observations, and the sounds of the wilderness. The first few days were standard, building a debris shelter, trapping small game, and maintaining a fire. But on the fourth night, the atmosphere in the valley shifted. The wind, which had been a constant roar through the pines, suddenly died down to an oppressive silence. Every bird, every rustling leaf, and every crackle of his fire seemed to simply cease to exist. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind that makes you feel like the forest is holding its breath, waiting for a predator to strike. Silas was sitting inside his shelter, his recorder running, when he heard a sound that made his blood turn to ice. It was a scream. It was a high-pitched, agonizing shriek of a man in total terror, coming from the dense brush about 50 yards away. Silas instinctively grabbed his hatchet, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He called out, "I'm here! Stay where you are!" But as soon as the words left his lips, the scream was repeated word for word, breath for breath, but it was his own voice. The person in the woods wasn't screaming for help, it was playing back Silas's own voice like a high-fidelity recording. Silas sat perfectly still, his knuckles white around the handle of his hatchet. He watched the tree line through the small opening of his shelter. Then, he saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was easily 7 feet tall, its skeletal ribs pushing through translucent gray skin that looked like wet parchment. It didn't walk. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs snapping and clicking like breaking bone with every step. It had a head that looked like a deer's skull wrapped in layers of glistening, muscle-red tissue, with eyes that were nothing but hollow pits of endless, starving hunger. The horror wasn't just in what he saw, but in the audio. The creature began to mimic Silas's own heavy, shuddering breaths, echoing them back to him with a microscopic delay. Silas whispered into his recorder, "If anyone finds this, it's not a bear. It's following my voice." The creature immediately whispered back, "It's following my voice," in a tone so intimate it felt like the thing was standing right next to him. Silas realized then that this thing wasn't just a predator, it was a collector of identities. It was waiting for him to break, waiting for him to make a sound it hadn't recorded yet. Silas didn't wait for dawn. He burst out of his shelter and ran. He didn't grab his gear, he didn't grab his boots. He ran until his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass and fire, feeling the creature jumping through the branches above him with an agility that was physically impossible. Every time he stumbled, he heard a wet, guttural laugh that sounded like a serrated blade tearing through thick leather. He finally reached his emergency cache near the trailhead, fumbling with the lock as the creature stood at the edge of the clearing, watching him with a frozen, lipless grin. Silas made it out, but he was never the same. Search and rescue teams later went back to the mouth of Echoes to find his camp. They found his shelter completely intact, but the interior was covered in a thick, translucent slime that smelled like copper and old earth. They found his digital recorder sitting on a stump, but when they played it, there was no audio of Silas's logs. There was only 30 minutes of a wet clicking sound, followed by a voice that sounded exactly like the lead investigator, speaking in a low, rhythmic whisper. "I found Silas. He's right here." There is a theory among the Deep Woods researchers on Reddit that the Wendigo doesn't just eat your flesh. It harvests the very essence of who you are. It wears your life like a mask until the mask rots away. But the real, bone-chilling question is this. Silas moved to the city and hasn't stepped foot in a forest in 3 years. But last night, his neighbor called the police, claiming she heard Silas's voice coming from Silas's apartment, screaming for help and begging for someone to open the door, even though Silas has been on a business trip in Europe for the last 10 days. What just happened? Imagine you are deep in the woods of the Pacific Northwest, miles from the nearest trailhead, and you decide to record a quick video on your phone to capture the beautiful scenery. You're talking to the camera, laughing about how quiet it is, but when you play the footage back a minute later, you hear something that wasn't there when you were filming. In the background of your video, coming from the bushes right behind you, is a voice, your own voice, repeating the exact sentences you just spoke, but with a 2-second delay and a strange metallic distortion. You realize with a jolt of pure adrenaline that you aren't just being followed, you are being recorded by something that is learning how to be you. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite portable power bank and submerge it in a bowl of thick, salty gravy right before they head out for a long day of filming in the wilderness. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, an area home to some of the most dense, moss-covered rainforests on the planet. This is a place where the trees grow so close together they form a wall of deep green, and the fog rolls in so fast it can swallow a hiker in seconds. Our main character is a man named Alex. Alex was an aspiring outdoor videographer, the kind of guy who never went anywhere without his high-end camera gear and a tripod. He loved the solitude of the deep bush, and he had a habit of talking to his camera as if he were hosting his own survival show. He was confident, fit, and felt completely at home in the wild. But in the summer of 2021, Alex realized that the silence he loved so much was actually a trap. Alex had hiked nearly 15 miles into a valley that wasn't even marked on the local tourist maps. He wanted to get footage of a specific hidden waterfall. The day started out perfectly, but by mid-afternoon, the forest fell into what we call an oppressive silence. Every bird, every squirrel, and every rustle of the wind through the ferns simply ceased to exist. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up because you feel like you've walked into a room where someone just stopped talking. Alex set up his tripod near a creek and started filming a segment about nature's serenity. He spoke for about 3 minutes, describing the trees and the air. When he finished, he sat down on a mossy log to review the footage. As he watched himself on the small screen, his blood turned to ice. On the recording, every time Alex paused to take a breath, a voice from the thicket behind him would finish his sentence. It was his voice, his pitch, his inflection, but it sounded mechanical, like a recording being played back through a biological speaker. Alex froze. He didn't turn around. He sat there, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He slowly reached for his headphones and plugged them into the camera to listen more closely. In the background of the audio, he heard a wet, rhythmic clicking sound, followed by a long, low whistle. And then he heard a sound that made him want to scream, the sound of his own camera's record beep, perfectly mimicked by something with lungs. He looked up from the screen and scanned the tree line. There, blending into the shadows of 2 massive cedars, he saw a figure. It was taller than any human had a right to be, easily 9 feet tall and impossibly thin. Its gray skin was stretched so tight over its skeletal frame that its ribs looked like they were about to burst through. It had no lips, just a row of jagged, yellowed teeth, perpetually exposed in a frozen, lipless grin. But the most horrifying part was its eyes. They weren't eyes. They were hollow black pits of endless starving hunger that seemed to be absorbing the light around it. The creature moved, and it didn't walk. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs snapping and clicking like breaking bone with every step. Alex realized with a wave of cold nausea that this Wendigo, wasn't just hunting him for meat, it was harvesting his identity. It was recording his speech patterns, his movements, and his reactions. Alex didn't pack his gear. He didn't grab his expensive tripod. He grabbed his camera, shoved it into his bag, and ran. He ran until his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass and fire. He could hear the creature jumping through the canopy above him, moving with an agility that defied physics. Every time Alex stumbled or let out a gasp of air, the creature would echo the sound back to him, laughing with his own voice, a wet, guttural laugh that sounded like a serrated blade tearing through leather. He finally burst through the tree line and reached his car, fumbling with the keys as the pale figure stood at the edge of the woods, watching him. Alex pinned the throttle and drove for 3 hours without stopping. When he finally got home and checked the camera again, he found a new file, a file he didn't record. It was a 10-second clip of Alex sleeping in his car at a rest stop 2 hours after he escaped. The camera was held by a long, pale hand with skeletal fingers, and a voice, Alex's voice, whispered into the microphone. Playback complete. Initiating replacement. There is a theory among the Deep Woods researchers on Reddit that the Wendigo doesn't just kill you, it replaces you. It studies your voice, your gait, and your memories until it can walk out of the woods in your skin and no one would ever know the difference. But the real bone-chilling question is this. Alex's parents called the police yesterday because they said Alex came home, sat at the dinner table, and didn't speak a word for 4 hours. He just sat there staring at them with unblinking eyes, and every time they asked him a question, his throat made a faint, mechanical clicking sound, and then he repeated the question back to them in their own voices. What just happened? Imagine you are renovating your dream getaway, a remote, hand-built cabin nestled deep in the jagged peaks of the Adirondacks, when you knock down a false wall in the basement and find a room that isn't on any floor plan. You step inside, expecting dust and old lumber, but instead, your flashlight beam hits thousands of pounds of human hair, meticulously braided and hanging from the rafters like weeping willow branches. You realize with a jolt of pure adrenaline that the hair isn't just old, it's organized by color, length, and texture. And as you turn to leave, you hear a wet, rhythmic clicking sound coming from the vent above you, followed by a voice that sounds exactly like your own, whispering, "I've been waiting for a new color." If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite antique renovation hammer and bury it 6 feet deep in the backyard right before they start their next weekend DIY project. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to the deep, lightless woods of upstate New York, an area where the timber is so thick it feels like the forest is constantly leaning in to hear you breathe. Our main character is a man named Toby. Toby was a freelance architect who wanted nothing more than to escape the noise of the city, so he bought a fixer-upper cabin that had been abandoned for nearly 30 years. He knew the history of the area was a bit off, whispers of people vanishing in the whistling woods and strange, tall figures seen standing at the edge of campsites, but Toby was a man of logic and blueprints. He didn't believe in the Wendigo or any other spirit of the woods. He believed in cedar planks and solid foundations. But in the autumn of 2023, Toby realized that some foundations are built on things much darker than stone. Toby spent his first month alone, working from dawn until dusk. But as October arrived, the atmosphere in the valley shifted. The wind died down to an oppressive silence, the kind of quiet where every bird and cricket simply ceases to exist, leaving you alone with the sound of your own panicked heartbeat. One night, Toby was measuring the basement when he noticed a discrepancy in the wall dimensions. He took a sledgehammer to a section of wood, and the wall gave way, revealing a narrow, hidden corridor. He stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the stagnant air. The smell hit him first, the scent of wet copper and old earth. At the end of the corridor was a heavy oak door, bolted from the outside. He slid the bolt and pushed it open. The room was filled, floor to ceiling, with human hair. There were long, blonde tresses, matted black curls, and braids of every shade imaginable. It looked like a macabre gallery. Toby felt a wave of cold nausea wash over him as he saw a small, familiar ribbon tied to one of the braids. It was identical to the one his younger sister wore the day she vanished 10 years ago. He dropped his light. The silence was broken by a jerky, unnatural gait coming from the floorboards above him, a snapping and clicking sound like breaking bone with every step. Toby sat perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Then, a voice came through the floorboards. It was his sister's voice, perfectly clear and high-pitched. "Toby, did you find my room? I've been so hungry." Toby scrambled out of the basement, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't pack his gear. He didn't grab his keys. He ran for the tree line, feeling the creature right behind him. He saw a pale, spindly shape moving through the branches above him, easily 9 feet tall, its skeletal ribs pushing through translucent skin, with eyes that were nothing but hollow pits of endless, starving hunger. Every time he stumbled, he heard a wet, guttural laugh that sounded like a serrated blade tearing through leather. He finally reached his truck and pinned the throttle, driving until he hit the nearest town. When search and rescue later went back to the cabin, they found the basement door wide open. The hair was gone. The room was completely empty, except for a single handheld camera, Toby's camera, which he swore he had left in the kitchen. When they played the footage, there was no video of Toby. There was only 30 minutes of a wet clicking sound, followed by a voice that sounded exactly like the lead investigator whispering, "The collection is almost complete." There is a theory on Reddit that the Wendigo, the thing that marks its prey with trophies, doesn't just want your life. It harvests your identity piece by piece until you are nothing but a shell. It wears your memories like a mask. Tapi pertanyaan yang sebenarnya adalah ini. Toby pindah ke kota dan tidak pernah kembali ke hutan. Tapi semalamnya terbangun karena suara gatal di pintu kamarnya. Ia melihat ke bawah selah pintu, dan ia melihat tumpukan rambut manusia yang panjang dan pirang sedang ditarik masuk ke dalam lubang ventilasi udaranya, diikuti oleh suara bisikan ibunya yang sudah lama meninggal, menanyakan apakah Toby ingin melihat koleksi barunya. What just happened? Imagine you are a search and rescue officer trekking through a dead zone in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest, looking for a missing hiker who disappeared 48 hours ago. You're calling out his name. Thomas, if you can hear me, shout back! And suddenly, you hear his voice clear as a bell, responding from a thicket of ferns just 10 feet away, saying, I'm right here, I'm hurt. You push through the brush to save him, but when you break into the clearing, you find a man standing there who looks exactly like Thomas. Same jacket, same hat, same face, except his eyes are nothing but hollow, black pits. And when he opens his mouth to speak, he doesn't use his lungs. He makes a mechanical clicking sound like a skipping record player before repeating your own name back to you in your own voice. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in storytelling format, then you have come to the right place. We post stories just like this one every single week. So if that is of interest to you, please find the like button's favorite professional SAR radio and submerge it in a bucket of thick black tar right before they head out on a critical midnight rescue mission. Before we get into the chilling details of today's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Today's story takes us to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, an area home to some of the most rugged, moss-covered terrain in North America. This is a place where the canopy is so thick that the forest floor is in a permanent state of twilight, and the fog can roll in so fast it swallows entire mountain ridges in seconds. Our main character is a man named Miller. Miller was a veteran search and rescue officer with over 15 years of experience. He was a man of cold logic, a man who had seen everything from grizzly attacks to hikers who had simply walked off cliffs in the dark. He didn't believe in the old legends or the whispers about things that haunt the high ridges. He believed in GPS coordinates, thermal imaging, and hard evidence. But in the spring of 2022, Miller encountered something that made him realize that the evidence can sometimes be the most terrifying thing of all. Miller was part of a 4-man team looking for a 24-year-old college student named David who had vanished while trail running. They were working in a sector known as the Blind Valley, a place where radio signals tend to drop and the silence feels heavier than usual. What we call an oppressive silence. It's the kind of quiet that feels like the world has ended and you're the only one left to witness the aftermath. Around 2 a.m., the team was moving through a dense stand of ancient cedars when they heard a voice. It was David's voice, coming from a ravine about 50 yards to their left. "Help down here, my leg is broken!" The team didn't hesitate. They scrambled down the slope, their headlamps slicing through the mist. Miller was the first to reach the bottom. He saw a figure sitting against a mossy log, wearing the exact neon yellow running vest David had been wearing when he went missing. Miller rushed over, shouting, "David, we've got you! Just stay still!" But as Miller got closer, his training took over, and he noticed something fundamentally wrong. The figure wasn't breathing. There was no misting of air in the freezing night, no rise and fall of the chest, and the figure was sitting perfectly still, not the stillness of an injured man, but the stillness of a statue. Miller stopped 10 feet away. "David?" The figure turned its head. It didn't turn like a human. It was a sharp, mechanical snap. As the beam of Miller's headlamp hit the face, Miller felt a wave of cold nausea wash over him. The face looked like a mask made of wet, gray parchment stretched too tight over a skull. The eyes were nothing but hollow, black pits of endless, starving hunger. And then the creature opened its mouth. It didn't use its vocal cords. It made a wet, rhythmic clicking sound, and then it spoke in Miller's own voice, using the exact words Miller had said into his radio 10 minutes earlier. "Sector 4 is clear. Proceed to the ridge." Miller's team members burst into the clearing behind him, but Miller screamed at them to stop. "Back away! That's not him! That is not David!" The creature, this mimic or Wendigo, stood up. It didn't stand up like a person, it unfolded itself. It was easily 9 feet tall, its limbs snapping and clicking like breaking dry wood with every movement. Its skin was translucent, showing the skeletal ribs and pulsing red muscle beneath. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, covering the ground with an agility that defied every law of physics. As it moved, it began to cycle through the voices of everyone in the search party, screaming their names and their radio calls back at them in a chaotic, distorted choir. The SAR team didn't wait. They turned and ran. They didn't care about their gear or the missing hiker. They were in a race for their lives. They could hear the creature jumping through the canopy above them, snapping branches as thick as a man's leg. Every time one of the officers stumbled, the creature would let out a wet, guttural laugh that sounded like a serrated blade tearing through leather. They reached their vehicles at the trailhead, fumbling with the keys as the pale figure stood at the edge of the woods, watching them with a frozen, lipless grin. Miller officially resigned from the SAR team the next day. He told his superiors he was suffering from burnout, but the truth was he couldn't close his eyes without seeing those black pits of hunger. Search and rescue later returned to the Blind Valley with a larger force to find David. They found his neon yellow vest, but it wasn't on a body. It was neatly folded and placed in the center of a large, flat-topped granite boulder. Surrounding the vest was a perfect, intricate spiral made of thousands of human teeth, none of which belonged to David. When the authorities checked the GPS logs of Miller's team from that night, they found something that made them seal the file forever. The logs showed that while the team was running for their lives away from the ravine, a fifth signal identical to Miller's GPS signature had stayed behind in the valley. That signal stayed perfectly still for 3 hours before it slowly began to walk toward Miller's home address, moving at a constant, tireless pace of exactly 4 miles per hour. There is a theory on Reddit that the Wendigo, the mimic, doesn't just hunt for meat. It harvests the template of its prey. It studies your voice, your gait, and even your digital footprint until it can walk into your house and sit at your dinner table, and no one would ever know the difference. But the real bone-chilling question is this. Miller hasn't stepped foot in the woods since that night. But last night, his wife woke up to find Miller standing in the kitchen in the middle of the night, staring at the wall and making a faint, mechanical clicking sound. And when she asked him if he was okay, he turned to her and repeated her question back to her in David's voice. What just happened?